Disturbing reports from child detention centers, tragic drownings along the Rio Grande. The humanitarian crisis at the border leads Congress to take action. They're coming for our homes. How those 5 words started a new divisive chapter in the race for San Diego mayor. And local cities are changing the way they elect their leaders, but it hasn't always led to more diversity in government. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, Kate Morrissey, who covers immigration and the border for the San Diego Union-Tribune, Scott Lewis, editor-in-chief of Voice of San Diego, and KPBS investigative reporter Claire Tregeser. Well, the photograph is shocking and horribly sad, and a warning to our TV audience, it is disturbing. This week, this image revealed to the nation and the world the true nature of our humanitarian crisis at the border. The bodies of a young Salvadoran father and his 2-year-old daughter faces down on the bank of the Rio Grande River, drowned in their desperation to cross from Matamoros, Mexico to Brownsville, Texas. The girl's head is tucked in her father's shirt in an attempt to keep her with him against the river current, her arms around his neck. And Kate, start with the desperation that causes some families like this one to risk their lives to reach the U.S. and ask for asylum.
So for families who are coming from what we call the Northern Triangle countries, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, a lot of what they're fleeing is gang-related violence, areas where a gang has taken control of an area and said, you know, if you're going to operate a business in this area, you have to pay us money. If you don't pay us that money, we'll kill you or we'll kill your brother, your child. There's also a lot of violence against women coming from those gangs. So in some cases, it's a more particular kind of violence that the women are fleeing. We do also see some folks fleeing because they've been a part of, say, counter-government protests in Honduras. We also see people fleeing rural areas of Guatemala that are particularly affected by droughts. And I saw a story recently about the drop in coffee prices, for example, and how that's affecting certain farmers. So
the climate crisis plays into this too. Yeah,
it's a whole conglomerate of issues that are making it very difficult for people to feel like they can survive where they're from, and so they're coming here.
And this image we started with here certainly got tremendous play. It's tragic, it's disturbing, but 4 more bodies were found that same day on Sunday, 55 miles west along that same river. Toddler, 2 infants, 20-year-old woman. Are these tragedies finally piercing the political noise and fog regarding this surge of Central American families coming up?
We certainly have seen a lot of attention on the issue this week. It's something that sort of, in terms of public perception, ebbs and flows. If you think back to last summer when the public was very concerned about the family separations that were happening at the border, there was a lot of conversation about the conditions that people were in and the conditions for somebody trying to cross the border and how dangerous it was. And we're seeing a lot of that conversation again, sort of particularly focused around this photograph. I think, you know, the particular circumstances of the family in the photograph have led to some increased conversation about the metering policy that a lot of folks who are more deeply involved in the immigration conversation have been having, how metering is the process of only allowing a certain number of asylum seekers to enter ports of entry on any given day. And so other folks are forced to wait in Mexico for months at a time. And this family was one of those families that eventually decided, you know, instead of continuing to wait here, let's try crossing the river and seeing if we can make our asylum request more quickly that way. And so, you know, we've heard about a number of people choosing to make that decision, and this was the outcome for this family, and that's made this issue a lot more visible.
Just to put a point
Scott?
on that, we had a reporter, Maya Krishnan, who went to Honduras for a week, and when she came back, I asked her what was the major feeling she got, what was kind of a big takeaway, and she described this pervasive sense of insecurity, this constant tension in Honduras, in San Pedro Sula, where she was, of just this just constant fear, whether it was people who were protesting or whether it was people just on the streets or people who were thinking of leaving. She's collected a lot of vignettes there on the site, but that fear, I think, is can't be understated about how much of a driver that is. And you say, well, why are they doing this? Why are they crossing? It's the desperation is just acute.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad she did that, because I feel like there isn't enough attention being paid to what is, the root cause, what is driving people to come to the border and then make these decisions.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I'll jump ahead to another question I had. 2 Democratic debates this week, one answered from Bernie Sanders in 4 hours of debates about getting at root causes. And here's part of what he said. What we have to do on day one is invite the presidents and leadership of Central America and Mexico together. This is a hemispheric problem. We don't seem to get that. I mean, we were talking before the show we get slices, and we're going to talk about specific things, the problems in Clint, Texas this week at the Child Detention Center, but we don't seem to get a lot on this whole step back. Let's address this regionally.
Well, I think we do hear some reverberations of that, particularly when you look at the criticism that's happened when the Trump administration took money away from the support that it was going to those countries to try and do something about the violence there. We do see the critics saying, why are you taking away this money that is, if we're going to do something about this issue, we need to look at what's going on in these countries.
More aid, not less aid.
Address the root cause of the problem. So you do hear those voices, but I don't know that it's necessarily in the main spotlight of the conversation right now. I do think it's interesting that when AMLO was running for president of Mexico, he was having a very similar conversation about wanting to bring together voices and really look at what was going on in these countries. But since he's come into office, we've seen him sort of bending to the Trump administration's wishes a lot more than actually pushing that conversation forward.
Yeah, about the debate too. Last night there was a big discussion about what allies would you repair relations with, and only one of the candidates mentioned anything about Latin America. Nobody mentioned Mexico or Canada. We've got to convene. This is our backyard, and the problems there, the climate change, the violence, the instability, like that is not going to get better by just ignoring it. And so hopefully there will be some awakening to, regardless of your political perspective, this needs to be addressed in a more comprehensive manner.
And we did see, as I mentioned at the outset, Congress finally did act this week with $4+ billion to go to the border, going to be spent on a lot of things, but prominent news story about squalid conditions in a federal facility in Clint, Texas. These sorts of things, do they motivate the public to say, hey, let's do something, let's get the debate going, this is important?
Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, I think is the short answer to it. I think with the combination of that report coming out with the photograph has really motivated a lot more public discourse than sometimes happens when we hear reports about these conditions. This report is one of the probably more critical ones that I've seen, but we do have these reports that come out periodically from this court settlement about the conditions that children are held in immigration-related facilities. And, we have heard criticisms coming out from the findings that these lawyers have when they go in about everything from whether or not they're provided soap to what the food is like to how long they're being held there. And like I said, this particular report seems to be a more severe version of what we've heard, but it's by no means the first time we've heard some of these criticisms. I think back even to a report that came out of staffers from Feinstein's office a little while back now that made some of these same findings in Border Patrol facilities locally here along the California border.
That was my next question. We haven't heard as much here as we have in places like Texas.
Well, and I think part of that is because, when you look at the sheer numbers of people crossing, Texas is getting a lot more crossers than we are. So their facilities have a lot more people, and when you have more people, there's it exacerbates things that are going on, perhaps. We had a video a couple weeks ago in one of my stories showing what it looks like inside one of the holding cells in San Ysidro that we were able to obtain. And, at the time the video was taken, there were only a couple of people in the cell, but what we learned is that, quite a few more people were held in a cell similar to that for quite a period of time. There was a group of people in the Remain in Mexico program who were held at the San Ysidro Port of Entry for about 20 days or close to that. while some of the back and forth was going on in the court system. And so, you can look at that space and say, well, it's intended to hold people for less than 72 hours, but you had people in there wearing the same clothing the entire time they were in there, because again, it's not meant to be a long-term space, and they weren't allowed to even change clothes for the time that they were in that cell.
Well, the timing on these tragic stories this week was pretty good since Congress was debating this. The president, his response, anything comes to mind here on how he's handling this?
Go back where you came from. I mean, one of the fascinating stories, I think, is the response that Mexico has had. They've put troops at the border. They're physically keeping people in a way that we haven't seen, I think, from trying to cross. And, so in the sense, he is, pushing Mexico, and Mexico is complying to do that. But the desperation is just building on those border areas, and then those people are making big decisions to move over still. So,
all right, we're out of time in this segment, but it's certainly one that we will continue to stay on because it's such an important issue for this area, our region, of course, the entire country. Well, we're going to move on. YIMBY versus NIMBY. We'll get to the definitions in a moment, but this sudden confrontation sparked by a San Diego councilwoman and mayoral candidate, Barbara Bree, has an explosive effect in her race against fellow Democrat Todd Gloria. And Scott, start with what we are talking about here and how Bree this week seemed to embrace the NIMBY position, even though she was denying that she was, kind of.
Yeah, for a few years, San Diego's been kind of dancing around a big reckoning. And the moment where the city really deals with the plans it's laid out, the sort of growth factors that are already there, we're creating more humans, we're having more humans here. People are still moving here in some cases, and jobs are being created here. And so the demand that's placed on housing has really caused housing to become so expensive that all of us, with employees or colleagues, are having trouble keeping it going. Tuesday morning, we got an email, everybody did, from Barbara Bree, who's running for mayor. She's a city councilwoman, and the subject line said, "They are coming for your homes."
And that got our attention, didn't it?
Yes, for our homes. And so it wasn't quite clear who they were, whether it was hordes of mobs that were going to come to La Jolla to take people's... Right, or who our homes are, exactly. What she referenced was a bill in Sacramento that would make it it would force cities to make it clear to builders what the rules are to pass some buildings or to get homes built. It would allow them it would force cities to not lower the number of homes that they've planned for. But a lot of its more severe draconian changes were stripped out, but she still raised the alarm about what that law would do to usurp local control or protection over some of these neighborhoods that she wants to protect. And then she also blasted YIMBY Democrats of San Diego, a relatively new Democratic club.
And we should say what YIMBY stands for.
Yes, in my backyard. So the idea being, like, we need to start saying yes to housing projects in our communities around specifically transit and high jobs areas, and so that we can accommodate this growth and protect people from having to deal with such high home prices.
As opposed to not in my backyard, NIMBY, the sprawl, and
yeah, and there's a real long tradition, as you well know, in San Diego politics of protecting San Diego. Peter Navarro ran for mayor in a no-growth platform in the 90s. Well, that same sentiment is still very strong, and Democrats are really bifurcated on this. They're young. There's a lot of young folks that say this YIMBY thing is what we need, but she slammed that, said Todd Gloria, her main rival, is championing their cause, and they are corporate Wall Street speculative interests, and it was something for her to say as she's made so much money in the markets and such, and she has done really well. And so it was a pretty striking moment. I don't think that her and Todd Gloria, frankly, have that big of a difference in their policies, but their willingness to embrace the different rhetorical sides has been really striking. And she's basically saying, we need to protect our neighborhoods, our neighborhood characters, especially some of these along the coast, and this guy is coming for your home.
And of course, go ahead.
When you asked her about it, she didn't necessarily say, I'm anti-density. She just said, I don't like the state control of where we can build our homes.
That you kind of want to have it both ways in that regard.
Yeah, there's basically a theory among this class of folks that wants to see more housing built that local politicians will never be influenced or never have the incentive to approve those kinds of things. And thus, it should be taken away. It should be Sacramento who says, if you're this kind of building around this kind of thing, it should be approved no matter what. And so that's the thing that she's pushing back against. But there's been a kind of constant last 5-10 years where politicians have said, we love smart growth or we love this kind of growth, but not here or not here. And so I think that, that's sort of, that has to be reckoned with, because the city passed a law called the Climate Action Plan that really envisions this sort of growth happening. It has to happen to comply with this plan. And so if you are against that kind of 3 to 4 story or 4 to 5 story building around transit areas, then you are against the Climate Action Plan that they passed. And that, two sides, especially among Democrats, that has not been reconciled. And there are two very strong wings sort of building out of that.
Now, what was the reaction? I mean, you mentioned how that was kind of a startling line on that mailer. What's been the reaction to that? And Todd Gloria's reaction as well.
Well, Todd hit her, but the most shocking one I thought was from the chairman of the Democratic Party in San Diego County, who said, basically, he didn't name her, but he said, how to run for office, or how not to run for office 101. Don't, from your mansion in La Jolla, hit a bunch of diverse young people who are trying to, address the homeless or the housing affordability and homeless crisis.
Get a foothold in the market. Yeah.
And do that in that way. And it was a really striking rebuke for a chairman.
He kind of indicated that there was some racial undertones to her email as well. They're coming for our homes. Did you get a sense of that?
Yeah, I think he said it plays into every ism possible,
right.
Elitism, racism. The chairman of the Democratic Party hit her for almost, implied racism. And then the leader of the Climate Action Campaign, Nicole Capritz, who's big on this, complying with this plan, she said, you can't be a climate champion, as she said, and hold these kind of views about protecting these characters of these neighborhoods.
Yeah, the idea, again, is to get people out of their cars. Stop the sprawl, stop the 35-minute commutes up north, get them near transit centers, more density, and stop burning fossil fuels in that regard.
Yeah, there's a lot of people on the coast that consider themselves environmentalists, but getting rid of or doing solar panels, changing how you get energy, that's one thing, but the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases is the car. And so they're saying if you ever want to address that thoroughly, you got to get people out of the cars, and that means you have to change the very fundamental look and feel of many of these neighborhoods.
Now, who does Barbara Bree seem to be wooing in her NIMBY approach? Is there a big constituency?
I think there is. I think, I moderated a debate in the Foothills La Mesa Democratic Party where there was a lot of older Democrats there, and they loved the person who was espousing protect your neighborhoods and be suspicious of these developers. And so, I don't think it's at all clear that the consensus around YIMBYism is really prevalent among Democrats, but we'll see how it shakes out. This mayor's race could very well be a referendum on that.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that this mayor's race is going to show kind of where the city is standing. And I have friends who are younger, consider themselves very progressive, but also say, we really shouldn't build any more homes because we don't need any more people here. We should just leave it the way it is. But would say they're progressive in every other way.
Right. Out of time on this topic, but it's fascinating. I'm sure we'll get into it more as we move along in this mayor's race. Well, we're going to move along. The idea is noble, increase racial diversity among city councils, but it took court action to make cities comply. We're talking about the switch to have city council members elected by district instead of citywide. And Claire, start with this impetus for this. Why district elections seem to better the chances of getting more people of color on city council?
Well, right. The idea is instead of holding a citywide vote where everyone in the city can vote for all the council members, you drop these districts, which is something that the city of San Diego has been doing for a long time. And then people, if there's a large pocket of maybe one minority in a certain area, they will be able to elect someone just from their area. And so therefore, increased diversity on their city councils.
And expense plays into it. It's obviously tougher to run citywide
right.
than
it's
in
much
your
harder
neighborhood.
for someone you need more money, more outreach to run across the city instead of just in one small area.
Get better known. Now, KPBS did an analysis, the impact in San Diego County of cities switching to district elections. First, how many switched and which ones haven't?
Well, so 5 have not switched: Coronado, Del Mar, La Mesa, National City, and Lemon Grove. But the rest have switched. A few have switched but haven't yet actually held their first district election. So we looked at 10 who have switched and have already had at least one district election.
And the impact or the bottom line on that?
Well, it's about half and half so far. So 5 haven't seen an increase in diversity on their city councils, and 3 of those, Encinitas, Poway, and Santee, I believe, have councils that are all white. But another 4 or 5 have seen their diversity go up by at least one council member.
All right, and it's a small sample, and it's only one election
right.
for a lot of these places
right.
so far.
Right.
Yeah, so the jury is out.
It's more, I mean, it's interesting to maybe look more at other examples across the state where they've had a little more time. And I looked at Escondido, which was one of the first to switch, and so they've had a little bit more time to see if there's any impact.
Yeah, give us some details there, because that's an interesting case.
Right, so Escondido switched back in 2012. They had their first district election in 2014, and this woman, Consuela Martinez, ran against a longtime white man incumbent and lost. She lost by about 70 votes, I think. But then she had a little bit more time, more organization. There was also a big blue wave in Escondido overall in 2018, and so then she was able to pick up a seat there.
So second time was the charm.
Yeah.
And how does that change the makeup of the council then? Because it was all pretty monolithically white
well,
for a long
before
time.
even they switched to district elections, Olga Diaz, who's now running for county supervisor, had been able to win in a citywide vote. So now it's split. There's 2 Latina women on the council, 2 white men, and then the mayor is also a white man.
And we should know the bottom line demographics there. It's been a long time since I delved into Escondido politics, but I think it was at least 50-50 in terms of Latinos in among the residents.
Well, and what's interesting is in the districts that they drew, the district that's majority Latino is barely majority Latino. I think it was 50.04% Latino. So they didn't actually draw a district that was overwhelmingly.
Mm-hmm. Scott?
Yeah, so one of the I felt like it kind of come off on the story that it didn't work, but if 50% of the cities that you checked out did have a significant increase or some increase in the difference and diversity of people who were there, that seems like for a short period of time, like an actual.
Oh yeah, for sure.
An actual.
I didn't mean
change.
to make it sound like it didn't work. And my story today said, it actually may also be too soon to tell. Like cities like El Cajon, where they drew districts, they haven't yet had their election where the districts with a large chunk of Middle Eastern population have gotten to vote yet.
Right.
So they're kind of gearing up for November 2020. So I think November 2020 is really going to be an even better test of, is this actually working?
Right. But the ones that remain white, like that does stand out. And is that a function of just there is not a large population of potential people of color who
in places like Poway or Encinitas, it's very difficult to draw a map where there's any district with a majority of minority population because there just aren't that many minority people there, and they don't necessarily live in one specific part of the city. Yeah. You really need it to be like a geographically concentrated area.
Now, you also interviewed, we should talk about the folks who are kind of getting displaced by these elections. Ed Gallo was one there in Escondido.
Yeah, he was a longtime councilman in Escondido. He said he wasn't a big fan of the districting process in the first place, and then he really didn't like it after he lost. But his point, he had a few points. One was that he pointed out that Olga Diaz was able to win with a citywide vote, and he said that she just worked hard and that's how she did it. I don't know if that's necessarily true. His other point, which is one that I heard from a few people, is that one possible outcome is that council members then really only look out for their own district, kind of like we're talking about a little bit with the NIMBYism. When you're just protecting your neighbors, then maybe you aren't looking out for the good of the city overall because you're only responsible to the people who live around you who elected you.
Well, that's an interesting point. Have we seen that in San Diego, which, as we noted, has had a district election?
Yeah, that was a point that a lot of people made in the, about 10 years ago when there was a lot of financial problems at the city. They would always say, like, politically, there was no incentive for any one of the individual council members to do anything hard to change how the city's finances were structured, because their motivation was almost wholly in making their neighbors happy, and nobody had any concern about or had any political incentive to actually take on very difficult decisions to either raise taxes or to cut employees or employee benefits or services. And so it always created this very tense situation. The counterbalance is supposed to be the mayor of these towns. The mayor is elected at large, and the mayor is supposed to represent the whole area and is supposed to guide and create the kind of tension that would help that. But that depends on who that mayor is and if they're good at their job.
Well, and I think all of the council members, including Consuelo Martinez, she said, it's not that I just care about my own neighborhood. I care about the good of the city. I'm sure every council representative would say, oh, I love the whole city. I'm, here to represent these people, but I want what's best for the entire city.
Yeah, kind of like the dichotomy between a congressperson in his or her district and a senator statewide.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it did, lately San Diego has functioned a little bit better, and the council is very strong compared to the mayor.
Well, we're out of time, but we'll watch that going forward. Got another election coming up, they're telling me. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable, and I'd like to thank my guests, Kate Morrissey of the San Diego Union Tribune, Scott Lewis of Voice of San Diego, and Claire Tregesser of KPBS News. And a reminder, all the stories that we discussed today, they're available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today, and join us again next week on the Roundtable.